And next, I'm delighted to welcome back to the university Dr. Suzanne Pritzker of the University of Houston, Graduate College of Social Work. Dr. Pritzker and I were actually students here together at the university back in the late 1900s. She began her career as a policy advisor to the Virginia Secretary of Education and working with the Virginia General Assembly as well. She's a recipient of numerous awards, and her research in Texas now focuses on young people's civic engagement. She now teaches and coordinates also the Austin Legislative Internship Program for graduate students in social work. And her presentation today is titled Civic Engagement Among Immigrant Youth, Understanding the Youth Perspective. Dr. Pritzker.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here, glad to be back at the university, and particularly really excited about this, the positive youth development focus of this conference. I come from a profession, social work, where our code of ethics calls for promoting individual well-being, meaningful participation, voice, self-determination. Yet I did a recent review of all the articles over the past decade appearing in social work's core journals recently, and found that research articles focusing on youth as assets to their communities through participation appeared in about 0.2% of articles in our profession. So despite this code of ethics, we're talking about youth as deficits as well in our profession. So I'm really glad to hear this conversation, to be a part of it. My own focus, as Tim outlined, I've spent most of my career involved in political engagement and political participation, but my research is really focused on adolescents. So going a little earlier than what Will was speaking about for the most part, that typically in our society we perceive adolescents across the board, including youth of color, as disengaged, apathetic, and not capable of civic involvement. So my own entrance into this work was as a social work graduate student in Richmond a number of years ago, when I was charged with putting together a project for a group of sixth grade students of color to work with them to create a community service project. And throughout this experience, and I was really excited. I did this when I was in sixth grade. Let's do this. Let's help them do this. And we faced so much community opposition, hearing that these kids couldn't be engaged in service. They're recipients of service, not givers of service. This is not something that they're capable of doing. And so I've spent much of the rest of my career looking at why not? And of course they can. And in fact, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but there is a UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which has been ratified by all but 2 UN member countries. We are one of those 2, that specifically calls for meaningful participation of youth in all of the institutions that they're involved in. That youth voice in childhood and adolescence is something that they're capable of, and in fact is a right. And what we see across the world in many other contexts are programs and opportunities and structures that are enabling young children and adolescents to engage in influencing their communities. So, my focus originally was on youth adolescents of color, but as I moved to Houston and really moved to a city that's an incredibly large refugee and immigrant hub, became very interested in immigrant adolescents. So where I want to start with is, what do we know so far about immigrant adolescent civic engagement? In the research, there's very little large-scale research. We don't actually know a lot. In fact, most of the immigrant adolescent articles start with, we don't know anything. Most of what there is are case studies, examples of specific programs where youth are engaged, but we don't really know what we're seeing from adolescents. We do know a little bit. We know that there are differences based on immigrant generation, based on whether immigrants are documented or undocumented. And also, we're starting to see differences, not surprisingly, based on the heterogeneity of the immigrant population. But this research is really focused particularly on voting-related activity and volunteerism, for the most part. I put up on this slide, but because we don't know a lot about immigrant adolescents per se, what we look to are what we know about, for example, low-income Latina adolescents. And To be honest, there's not a whole lot of civic engagement research on Latinos either, more than on immigrants generally. But in this work, what we have seen is that generally Latino adolescents hold more negative attitudes towards civic involvement, are less likely to engage in traditional civic activities, what we most commonly measure and think of as civic engagement, either volunteering or voting. Okay. But recently, the literature has started to ask some questions about this state, what we do know, this sort of the supposed lack of engagement. And I think these questions have direct relevance to talking about immigrant adolescents. And so specifically, when in research we're measuring adolescent engagement, are we really measuring the right things? Has our focus on this sort of gold standard of voting, which is part of why we don't think about adolescent engagement a lot, because, well, they're not old enough to vote, so why would they be engaged? But voting and then volunteerism, are we then missing some of the other activity that adolescents really are engaged in? And moreover, are there new and different ways that adolescents are engaging that we're just not aware of yet? And then, in fact, recently, Kantara has pointed out that perhaps even by focusing on behaviors, by when we talk about civic engagement, and I think many of you may have heard civic engagement this talk and kind of thought we were talking about the political arena, that when we focus specifically at that, is that actually in and of itself a deficit perspective on people of color, on youth of color who may not be engaged in these activities? And when we say this is what matters, we're excluding a lot of the work that they're really engaged in their communities. So there's some suggestion, and where we're starting to go in the literature is that perhaps rather than traditional forms of civic engagement, or maybe in addition to those, that immigrant adolescents may be more likely to engage in what are kind of termed as expressive civic activities, where they're expressing what they want. Protesting, for example, is expressive. It's not voting. It's going out there and saying, this is a problem, this is a change that we want here. But also potentially with activities connected to their ethnic or immigrant identities. So issues, particularly advocating around issues in their community, doing work in formal or formal engagement with other community members. So if what we measure is formal volunteering, are we missing, for example, that adolescents might be actually helping out community members that are not necessarily their family, but doing translations, tutoring for other community members? Some of what Will talked about, this relationships with other, potentially bridging different groups in the community. So we're starting to ask, are these things happening? So I wanted to look at my own research to see whether we are seeing different patterns in engagement among immigrant youth. And full disclosure, much of my research, I sort of stumbled upon an interest in immigrant youth after I designed some of my research. So some of these measures are not in what I'm going to share with you yet, but I want to give an idea of what we may have an indication of. So I conducted a survey of adolescents in Houston, and I'm giving you just a little bit of demographics, because just even going into public schools in Houston, pretty diverse demographic. So a lot of my research has been school-based, and in a school context in Houston, I cannot ask about immigration status. So I don't actually know which of my youth are immigrants and are not. But I asked instead, were you born in the US or not? Which obviously is missing a lot, and there are many reasons why being not born in the US could mean that you're not an immigrant. But in the communities where I did my research, it's likely that large numbers of these are immigrants. And first generation, and then definitely second generation immigrants. So the sample that I'm going to show you, I'm looking at born in the US, which is about 82% of my sample, but another 17% that's born outside. So I know that this is harder to see, but I want to highlight a couple of the of what I found, just looking at a series of civic activities, what the adolescents that I was studying were engaged in. So the green, if you can see that, all the green bars are the born in the United States, and the red are born in another country. And so in both groups, we see that the adolescents in general were most engaged with doing volunteer work and what's called boycotting, so intentionally buying things because you want to support buying from a certain company because you like the values of that company, you think that what they're doing is important. It's kind of the similar vein as boycotting, but instead of not buying, you are buying. So those were pretty widespread across all the adolescents. But what was interesting to me is that in all but one case where there was a significant difference between how born in the US and non-born in the US adolescents participated, it was the born outside of the United States students who participated in civic activities at a higher rate. And so our, I can highlight this, but so that's not very well. Okay, so students born outside of the US were more likely to have gotten involved in issues like health or safety that affect their community. So going back to this idea that the research has started to suggest that maybe there's more of a direct engagement in trying to strengthen your own local community. And so that was backed up here. Also, not so surprisingly, though at a lower rate, more involvement in participation in protests, marches, or demonstrations. So I know we talk a lot about protests in immigrant community. It was about 20% of these adolescents who were engaged in protests at a significantly higher rate than US born. Also boycotting and expressing their political views online. And so I just want to highlight that while some people might look at this data and say, well, most of the youth are not engaged, there's a lot of engagement happening. This does not match a purely apathetic group of adolescents who are not engaged. And then we're seeing as these students born outside of the United States were more engaged. So I want to move here to talk about, so I say that I think there are some promising signs for immigrant adolescent engagement, but there's some key challenges that immigrant adolescents face as well. So the first, I think, is a lack of education and exposure to civic engagement. There are disparities in access to learning to be civically engaged and to mechanisms to do that. And I think that while our research really speaks to this in low-income and minority communities, that spreads to that the overlap with immigrant communities is strong there. So we often know there's fewer community civic institutions, and that's where you learn a lot of what having these organizations, there's a lot of research that ties organizational affiliation with civic education involvement, but also there's less opportunities for civic education in school. I know in Texas, for example, all we care about right now is getting our students to pass the test. When you're focused on passing the test, you're not focused on civic education. Frankly, social studies is not on those tests so much, but also being engaged in your community as a learning mechanism is seen as sort of taking away from the test. So I've done some research on service learning and, for example, found that there is less service learning, which is a mechanism for learning about civic involvement, less service learning in high poverty schools than in low poverty schools, but particularly so in high poverty suburban contexts. So this is likely to be the case in immigrant communities as well. And there's also research suggesting that families with limited familiarity with the US political system don't feel equipped to teach their children about how to be engaged. So whereas I was taken to the voting, to every year with my dad, and I pulled the lever and learned about civic involvement at a very young age because of that, immigrant families may not have the opportunity and either the opportunity or the skills to be able to share that, and they certainly feel so far in the research that they cannot. Obviously, some immigrant youth are undocumented, and therefore that lack of citizenship may be a barrier to participation, and also experiences of marginalization and discrimination can be a barrier to not feeling like you have a voice and wanting to participate. But what's interesting is we're very mixed right now in the literature as to whether these are limitations or incentives, right? Whether being not having citizenship makes you say, okay, I don't belong here, or says, I'm going to motivate to try to change the system, whether being marginalized, same concept. So we really don't know yet, which, there's evidence in both ways. So I think more research is needed here. And certainly the experiences of immigration themselves and the trauma that may have occurred and those sort of things can also be an impact. But something that I found in my research that I was really surprised by actually is I conducted a civic intervention with some Latino adolescents in Houston. And after the fact, about 6 months later, I did focus groups with the kids. And I asked them, would you, I asked them questions about whether they did these projects that they were really interested in cleaning up their communities and volunteering and doing all sorts of different things in their community. And I asked them about this 6 months later. And when they started talking, I was really struck by how much they felt like the adults in their lives were actually an impediment to their community level engagement. So at the beginning of this morning, Dr. Tolan talked about adolescents making use of adults. And what was interesting is that adolescents were trying, in the cases I'm going to describe, trying to make use of adults, and then they couldn't. So these kids were going and saying, we tried to do something, we tried to address these problems in our community, but it was out of our hands. We couldn't because we had no mechanism in this institutional support to do so. But moreover, when we saw problems and we wanted to do something, adults don't do anything about it. And they talked about how that was sad, and that this adult, and here they're talking about both their parents and their teachers, okay? They talked about, one of them was talking about picking up trash in the community, and said here, like, that the teacher, that she was going around and picking up trash, and the teacher was just standing there and watching, and in their community, and saying, you're a teacher, you're telling me to do this, but you don't do any of it. I'm willing to help my community, but why not you? And also that another student talked about wanting to go and paint over graffiti in the playground, and the adults were cutting them off. The adults were saying no, and this left them discouraged and disempowered. So I found this really interesting, that there's this sort of message, and this harkened me back to what I had seen with those sixth graders many years ago, this idea that it was adults saying that kids couldn't do these things and getting in the way of their civic engagement. So what next? Where do we go with this? So one thing I just really want to highlight again is my research is not necessarily, yes, there is some apathy, there is some disengagement, but among adolescents in general, but for immigrants, we're seeing some of these structural impediments that are also getting in the way, whether it's about access or about the adults in their lives. So what can we do moving forward? So one thing I want to encourage generally is that we rethink how we talk about civic engagement, that move away from this gold standard of voting and volunteering. And as somebody who's been passionate about politics and political involvement my whole life, I struggle with this a little bit, but I think, yes, ultimately we need to change political systems and we need people involved in doing that. But if we discourage, if we say your involvement doesn't count now, what you're doing isn't good enough, how does that lead you to want to go and try other forms of engagement later on? And so that as we prioritize, what we're prioritizing is actually is communicating this message that what you're doing isn't good enough. And that I think along with this, we really need to think about the informal forms of engagement, particularly for immigrant adolescents, that helping other immigrants, helping your neighbors, that those need to be important things that we're valuing and encouraging and using potentially as platforms to help facilitate youth involvement in other activities. Also, I think it's important that we understand that there are different ways to effectively engage adolescents in different immigrant communities, and that's important from the research. But also, I think more practically, where I really want to end here is that I think that in designing programs working with immigrant youth, it's really important to help youth and adults work together and learn from each other in terms of being involved in civic engagement. If what we're seeing is adolescents wanting to and then getting these messages that they're not capable of or shouldn't be involved, then maybe bringing them together with the adults can make a difference. And actually some of the work that I've seen in other countries has actually shown that when youth do engage in civic engagement, when they show what they're able to do, adults come back and say, oh, wait a minute, I didn't know kids were capable of this. I didn't know that they could do this. So promoting ways that youth and adults could be engaged in their communities and giving back to their communities together. I think also that there's an important role, particularly for immigrant adolescents when they don't necessarily have as much exposure to the civic role modeling in their homes or in their communities, is that this is an important role for schools. And I think that this really calls for the need for experiential opportunities that expose adolescents to U.S. immigrant adolescents to civic norms, but also kind of going back to those quotes that I talked about. Teachers, schools, those in school settings, we have an obligation to model what we're asking from our kids. That if we say that, that you need to be engaged in your communities, you need to go back, or it's a problem that you're not, maybe we need to look at what we're doing and what they're seeing, and that there's a really important role that schools can play in showing what engagement can look like, especially when the models aren't necessarily able to do that at home. But I think finally, we really need to think about the role that discrimination and marginalization may be playing, and help youth to channel their experiences of marginalization, help immigrant youth channel their experiences of marginalization into civic activities that may make sense for where they are, that frustration and the difficulty around marginalization, around their discrimination experiences, what can they do about that? And I realize that for undocumented immigrants, there's certain the coming out process is an issue, but are there other mechanisms that we could think about to help them find ways in maybe arenas that may be a little more palatable to start to express their views, and to help them feel that they have a voice. And we know that when youth are empowered and feel that their voice is heard, that they engage again. So I think they're looking at how we can help that for immigrant youth as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and end here. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I appreciate it.